Thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be back in Stockholm. This is my 5th visit here, and each and every time you've humored me to speak in English. And I have to admit, I have to confess that I haven't learned that much Swedish in all this time, and that's a real embarrassment because I haven't had to, but thank you for coming out again. I am going to talk about why right-wing terrorism helps the enemy and hurts our cause, and I think this fits in well with the anarcho-tyranny theme. And I want to begin with a quote from Nietzsche. Nietzsche said, I believe it was in Twilight of the Idols, he said, "The crowned heads of Europe sit more securely on their thrones because anarchists are now shooting at them." And the point was, of course, that because anarchists were shooting at and stabbing and bombing the crowned heads of Europe, that gave the crowned heads of Europe ample reason to ramp up the level of surveillance and repression in their societies, and so they were sitting more securely because of assassins. And I think that that's a lesson that we all need to pay attention to today. Right-wing terrorism, like Brenton Tarrant's or Brenton Tarantino's, as some of us like to call him, shooting spree in New Zealand, helps the enemy and harms our movement in 4 ways. First of all, it creates public sympathy in our people for the victims of these crimes, and the victims of these crimes belong to groups that we would like to build a case for separating ourselves from them. And it makes all the liberals want to just cling to them even more and dress like them and act like them and show solidarity with them. That's not a good thing. Second, it makes white advocates look bad because our job is to convince the world that white nationalism is a solution to ethnic conflict, not a cause of ethnic conflict. Third, it energizes the left. It gives them options for signaling and manufacturing martyrs and ginning up moral panics. And fourth, those moral panics are used as pretexts for repressing us, repressing our freedom of speech and repressing our right to bear arms. And those are bad things. So it's a popular idea that terrorism is a desperate measure, an act of desperation, and desperate times call for desperate measures, right? But I want to argue that times aren't quite so desperate as some people think. Yes, as I argue in this book, The White Nationalist Manifesto, available in the lobby there, and I will sign it for you if you like. As I argue in The White Nationalist Manifesto, long-term demographic trends for white people are alarming. If we do not halt the existing demographic trends, we're first going to lose control of all of our homelands, and then we're simply going to become extinct as a race. But that end point still lies a couple centuries off. And even in parts of the white world where the majority of births are now of non-whites, and there are cities and states in the United States, and probably cities in Sweden, where the majority of births are of non-whites, it's still going to be some decades before these people have voting rights and can exercise political power. And by the time that happens, you might find that a great deal of white people are willing to countenance limiting the franchise or doing away with voting altogether. So we are going to have some decades to get things right. 20 years, 30 years, 50 years, depending on what country we're in. And that means that we have a lot of time to prepare, a lot of time to plan, a lot of time to get it right. And if doing it right won't save us, then doing it wrong won't save us either. So we just have to do it right. We have to do it the right way, and we have to figure out what the right way is. And the idea that things are so dire that we have to go on shooting sprees in hopes of setting off waves of repression that will cause some upheaval in the white world, those are desperate panicky, and I think stupid and self-destructive, self-defeating measures. And I want to convince you all of that today. Not that any of you think this way, but I want these ideas to spread out in our community where they might come into contact with people who are given to this kind of apocalyptic thinking. It is the case that long-term demographic trends are alarming, but there are a lot of medium-term social trends that are working in our favor. And we need to recognize that these trends give us a great deal of room for maneuvering and a basis for actually coasting or surfing our way into power someday. There are some waves that are rising. And national populism is a growing phenomenon. It's really going to be here to stay. There's a book called National Populism by two British political scientists named Eatwell and Goodwin, Roger Eatwell and Matthew Goodwin. And in that book, they argue that there are some deep-seated and long-term political and social trends that are giving rise to national populism, and these trends are not going to abate any time in the coming decades, which gives us great opportunity. The populist moment that the left-wing press has been talking about is wishful thinking. It's going to be a lot longer than a moment. It might be longer than the lifetimes of the people who are anxious to write its obituary today. The four trends that Eatwell and Goodwin talk about, first of all, are distrust. The distrust of the people in the establishment is at an all-time high in every white country. And that level of distrust is only rising. I can only imagine that social distrust in Great Britain is at an all-time high as it's now become apparent that what the people wanted is not what the establishment wanted, and the establishment is not going to deliver Brexit. That is good for us because that causes social distrust. Distrust in the political system. Distrust in the political system is a condition for changing the political system. The political system can only compel people without violence if people basically trust that they are governed by people who belong to their tribe and who basically look out for their interests, people that they trust. That level of social trust is declining rapidly in every white country, and that is giving rise to national populism. The second trend is destruction. And Eatwell and Goodwin specifically talk about the destruction of identity by multiculturalism and globalization, and and immigration specifically. And they go so far as to argue that there's nothing racist, really. There's nothing objectionable about people wanting the country that they grew up in to resemble itself by the time they die, or to pass on a country that they recognize to their children, which is kind of an amazing and apologetic statement. But they actually argue there's nothing per se immoral about wanting to maintain the ethnic balance of your society, and the erosion of white majorities and white civilization in European countries due to non-white immigration is fueling national populism. The third trend they talk about is destruction, and specifically the destruction of working class and middle class standards of living by globalization. That is also driving people towards populism because populists promise to put limits on free trade. They promise protectionism and reindustrialization. And that is a powerful message to people who are increasingly seeing real economic deprivation and who feel like their children are not going to have as good a life as they had or their grandparents had. So that's important. The final trend is called de-alignment, and de-alignment simply means that as distrust arises in the establishment and as communities are destroyed by multiculturalism and immigration, and as living standards plummet due to globalization, people are not aligning themselves with the center-left, center-right condominium-type governments that we have in most Western societies. New political possibilities are emerging to be vehicles for the popular will, which is trending in the national populist direction and against globalization. The main factors driving the rise of white identity politics are not people like me or Jared Taylor or people like you out on the internet exercising your freedom of speech as long as we've got it. That's what the enemy, that's what the establishment wants to believe. They want to believe that the only reason multiculturalism isn't working is because they're being deceived by persuasive silver-tongued deceivers like me or Jared Taylor. They don't know the half of it. The reason that multiculturalism isn't working is that it can't work. And it will only continue to fail, and it will only intensify in its failure as they double down on the policies that are driving people in our direction. So as hard as I work, and as hard as Frody works, and Martin works, and all of you work to raise people's consciousness, we're not doing a fraction of the consciousness raising that the establishment is doing by enforcing multiculturalism and globalization, which means that if they shut us all down, if they deplatform us, if they censor us, it's not going to stop these changes. It's not going to stop the growth of white identity politics. It's simply going to make it harder for them to monitor. It's going to make it cruder and more violent and more unpredictable, but it is not going to stop it. And they can't stop us, really. They can't stop us because they can't take us off the internet completely. The only way to do that is to shut the whole thing down, and the global economy depends upon it, so it's simply not an option. They can slow us down by censorship, but they cannot stop us. And there are massive trends that are rising and will continue to rise in the coming decades that we can surf into power and influence, which means that the longer we can stay in the argument, the more we can inject ourselves into public debate, the broader we can cast our nets, the sooner we're going to win. Because in any fair debate, our arguments beat theirs. We have truth on our side. Everything they are arguing is based upon lies and sanctimony and cover-ups of the catastrophes they create. So the longer we stay in the argument, the closer we are to victory. They're not going to keep us entirely out of the argument, though, because they can't. And so really, to my mind, the only question is how long, not whether, but how long it takes for us to change public opinion sufficiently that we inaugurate a new paradigm, that we sweep away globalization, and that our kind of nationalism becomes the dominant paradigm in all of our societies. It's not if, it's simply a matter of when, because the longer we stay in the debate, the greater our reach, the quicker it's going to happen. We win every argument in every fair debate. And this is why the enemy wants to shut us down, because they're tired of losing. They're tired of losing in debates with us. You know, they're so smug and so serene that all of this was going to proceed according to plans. They didn't even factor in the idea that there would be a pushback. Multiculturalism just means every year there'll be fewer white people, more white dispossession. And they actually were arrogant enough to think that there would be no pushback. We are the pushback. And the pushback started in comment sections and on Twitter. And these people got in arguments with us, and they got their asses handed to them. They lost over and over again. They started feeling scared, and that's why they're starting to scream for censorship. They're tired of losing arguments to us. So where does this bring us to the terrorism question? Well, terrorism, like I said, increases sympathy for our enemies, decreases sympathy for us, makes us look like maniacs, when we're really the most sensible and sane people in the world. Try that on for size. The rest of the world is crazy. We're the sane ones. That is the truth. And we've done nothing wrong, and we think nothing wrong. A lot of us have been convinced there's something dirty about what we're doing, that we're actually doing what's morally right and what's in harmony with truth and what's in harmony with everything practiced by our ancestors and everything that our future generations need to survive and flourish. And yet, these people try and convince us that we're the crazy ones, whereas they are imposing a utopia which is rapidly turning into a dystopia, a utopia that has never worked anywhere. Diversity has never improved any society anywhere. And yet they insist that if they just have more power and if they can just shut us down, it's all going to work. Okay? Terrorism, again, strengthens our enemies' resolve. It energizes them against us, and it gives them pretexts for shutting us down. And that delays. It won't deny, but it does delay when we win. And that's not a good thing. Strategically, that's the stupidest thing I can imagine. Any smart combatant, before he starts a fight, takes stock of his strengths and weaknesses and the strengths and weaknesses of his enemy. So let's take stock. We don't have people. We're a tiny minority. We lack numbers. We lack money. We lack leadership. We lack institutional power and influence. On the other hand, we do have truth and morality on our side. And our strengths and weaknesses are the mirror image of the strengths and weaknesses of our enemies. Our enemies have numbers. They have the vast majority of our own people, even our own families, in a headlock. Literally, their minds are locked up with this nonsense that they're preaching. They have the numbers. They have effectively unlimited money. They can just print it. They've got manpower. They have leadership. All the political leaders are working for them, right? We have no political leaders who actually want to follow us. They're embarrassed at upstart populist eruptions like Brexit. And they're trying to figure out how in the world can we possibly not do what the people want and still get their votes, right? That's the political problem of our leaders. All the leaders are on their side. But the establishment has some important disadvantages. First of all of their policies are premised on lies, on falsehoods about what makes society good, and also on moral falsehoods. Moral falsehoods that can only be practiced by being rank hypocrites. They have never been so refuted by their own actions as they are today. They're corrupt, they're hysterical, they're degenerate, and they're creating catastrophic consequences that we can point out. So let me ask you, given those strengths and those weaknesses on our side and on their side, where should we attack our enemies? Where they're strongest or where they're weakest? They have all the guns. Not all the guns, but they have the military, the police, right? They've got the mall cops. They're all on their side. We couldn't even beat the mall cops, okay? Much less the police and the armies. And we got lots and lots of guns in private hands in America, but unfortunately, Second Amendment enthusiasts will only dust off their guns and consider shooting at the government if the government comes to take their guns. So as long as you leave them their guns, they'll allow all their other freedoms to be taken away. And that's just the sad truth about the gun nuts, okay? So we can't beat them in a fight based on armed force or on outspending them. They can print all the money they want. But we can out-argue them. We can out-meme them. We can mock them. We have enormous advantages in the intellectual and cultural realm of struggle. So we should attack their weaknesses from our strengths. And that's what we've been doing for some time. And that's where we've been making great gains. How many people in this room were, as we say, red-pilled within the past 5 years? Just a show of hands. That's a good number. How many in the last 10 years? And of course, that includes the ones who were 5, in the last 5. It's a very large number. We've been making enormous inroads into the popular consciousness because we've finally gotten on the web, and we've gotten outside the media monopolies, and we've found creative ways of reaching people. We have our own media now. This is very, very important. Our movement is growing and has been growing for some time because we've been successful in cultural struggle, metapolitics. We have not been successful in street activism or taking up arms against the government. So again, what do smart people do? They attack the enemy where they're weakest from their strengths. We are attacking them at their weakest point, namely intellectually and morally, from our strengths, which are intellectual and moral. And we've been making enormous progress. In 2015, 2016, jumping on the Trump phenomenon, the so-called alt-right, which is this online movement that emerged really in 2015 and 2016, came out of the libertarian world, adopted this term alt-right that had been coined in 2010, and then charged forward and became the bane of mainstream conservatism and the most energetic supporters of Donald Trump. That movement was a beautiful thing at its peak. It was a lot of fun, right? And it was an example of metapolitics in action. Then people got a little giddy, and they started memeing in real life. The first IRL memeing incident that was a big setback was so-called Hailgate, and we found that it didn't play well in the real world. Then in 2017, there was a rash of public demonstrations and public speeches and things like that, and we found that we were not able to really stand up against the left, the organized left, because even Antifa, who are criminals, could count on the sufferance, the indulgence, the secret support of the legal establishment. Every one of the rioters that trashed Washington, D.C. At the Trump inauguration has now been let off. Took a couple years, but they've all gotten off, right? Meanwhile, people who defended themselves from these people are having the book thrown at them, right? And our organizations are being plagued and really going to be destroyed and bankrupted by lawfare. In 2017, we suffered enormous defeats because we thought in the United States we could take an online metapolitical movement out in the streets where we were at systematic disadvantages facing the enemy. We charged them at their strongest from our weakest, and lo and behold, we lost. Unpredictably, who could have ever predicted that we would lose in these asymmetrical struggles? But we were winning in a different asymmetrical struggle, the one where we had the advantage, namely the advantage of morality and truth on our side, the online struggle, the metapolitical struggle. We need to get back to that, basically. Now, we can't in short, we can't outgun them, we can't outspend them, but we can out-argue them. And we can mock them and humiliate them and cause them to rage quit, and break their spirits. We can do that. And we need to get back to doing what's successful. Now, there are some moral arguments that people have made in defense of what Tarrant did. And I want to just deal with those very briefly. Don't people have a right to self-defense, individually and collectively? I actually had somebody ask me, what's the difference between Brenton Tarrant and Charles Martel? And the answer was very simple. Charles Martel was the legitimate leader who had his people behind him, whereas Tarrant was basically a lone guy who's now execrated as a moral freak and monster. Okay? And there are fewer people who sympathize with the kinds of views that he had after his attack, probably, than before it. Okay? Others say, well, if the government is in cahoots with invaders, if it's treasonous, don't we have a right to take up arms? Isn't there a right to be a vigilante against injustice? or a revolutionary? And I would say absolutely. A government that does not govern in the interests of its people is illegitimate, and there is a right to overthrow it. There is a right to revolution. The only question is, then, how do we go about this? What's the most rational way to go about changing the regime? And again, you have to look at your powers, your strengths and weaknesses, and those of the enemy, and then he made the wrong decision, right? He made the wrong decision, and we need to point that out over and over again. Tarrant, though, actually wanted to make things worse. He actually wanted to provoke the crackdowns on freedom of speech. He actually wanted to provoke crackdowns on gun rights, because he had this strange idea that if we can speak less and defend ourselves less, that somehow that'll make us so mad that in the absence of having weapons or the ability to communicate with one another, we'll suddenly gel into this mass uprising and overthrow the current system. It's a crack-brained, dumb idea. And yet, this is what he did. And I am convinced, as Martin is, that he made a donation to Martin Sellner, precisely to harm Generation, the identitarian movement in Austria. Why? Because it was a bright and shining example of a different approach. He wants to harm. He wanted to harm us. He wanted to harm them. He wanted to harm anybody but people who wanted to take up arms against people praying, basically. That, I think, makes him indistinguishable from Antifa. He wanted what the Antifa wanted. And I think we should hate him like we hate Antifa. Even though he started out nominally on our side and sharing our concerns through a lot of bad reasoning, he ended up trying to shut us down, trying to provoke repression, when it's precisely those measures that will delay rather than speed the day that we actually win. Like I said, back in 2015 and 2016, the online alt-right was a hell of a lot of fun. But what happened is it inculcated an attitude of frivolity into the movement that I think reached its absolute nadir in the live stream of this terrorist, this smirking reaper who live streamed him shooting a bunch of people with weapons covered with memes, right? And I watched it. I think you should all watch it. The thing that's most astonishing is the total lack of pathos of all these people dying, except for one incident. It was astonishingly bland. I thought, is this what mass death looks like? It's so boring. You know, I wonder how the TV movie is going to do this, because I'm sure it's going to be filled with a lot more pathos. It's going to tug at your heart. But it was appalling watching this smirking guy shooting all these people, because I realized that every single bullet that was hitting these people was killing more than just the worshipers in those mosques. It was killing our people, and it will kill more of our people for every day that he delays the ability of Swedes and Englishmen and Americans and every other European people to turn this trend around and regain control of our societies. He killed a lot more people than those people in that mosque, and he killed a lot of white people by making our victory delayed. Not denied, but delayed. And this is why I despise these sorts of retards, and I think we should all hold them in contempt. Seriously, I want to smack the alt-right smirk off the face of our movement. We're not going to win the most serious battle our race has ever faced unless we are much more serious men. So thank you. Thank you.